In The Lost World, Michael Crichton takes us on a disturbing journey that goes beyond the limits of entertainment and adventure that characterize Steven Spielberg's film. The novel delves into a much darker and cruder reality, where science and nature collide in a brutal way. The novel creates an atmosphere of terror through vivid descriptions of dinosaurs and their behaviors. Crichton delves into the horror of the unknown, emphasizing the imminent danger posed by dinosaurs and the fragility of human life in the face of these creatures. There is a focus on sadness and loss, showing the reality of dinosaurs as beings that have been brought back to a world that does not belong to them. The characters in the book deal with fear in a more psychological way. Their reactions are intense and personal, and the way the characters interact with the natural environment, full of dangers, heightens the sense of horror and despair. In contrast, Steven Spielberg's film opts for a lighter and more exciting approach, emphasizing action scenes. The film includes spectacular chases and tense moments, but often prioritizes adrenaline over horror. The characters are portrayed as heroes in crisis situations, where we can see how they overcome their fears and are rarely shown to be vulnerable. An example of this is the climax of the story. In the novel, the main characters, including Ian Malcolm and Sarah Harding, manage to escape from Isla Sorna after a series of dangerous encounters with dinosaurs. The novel leaves an uneasy feeling about the future of the dinosaurs and nature itself, as Isla Sorna becomes a sort of sanctuary for these animals. While in the movie, the ending is more epic, including a scene in San Diego where a T-Rex escapes and causes chaos in the city, which is totally original to the movie and was possibly added to keep viewers more attentive, something quite common for Hollywood productions. Lost World takes place years after what happened in Jurassic Park. The story takes place on Isla Sorna, an island that belonged to the company InGen. On this island would begin cloning experiments by Dr. Wu. The island acted as a breeding ground for animals that in the future would be transported to Isla Nublar to be part of Jurassic Park. The island was abandoned after what happened in Nublar, so in Sorna there are only facilities and laboratories in ruins that have been gradually consumed by the jungle. This story explores a more sinister aspect, because according to the files of the internal network of InGen, the success rate when creating dinosaurs was very low. The specimens were born with deadly genetic defects and died as soon as they were born in large numbers. It is also explained that others were born with characteristics that should not be typical of their species due to genes from other organisms used to complete the genetic sequence. But since the percentage of successful births was so small, scientists did not oppose these new creations with anomalous characteristics, giving rise to the horrible creatures described in Lost World. Crichton's descriptions of how the animals relate to each other and how the ecosystem of this lost world works is quite interesting. For example, on Isla Sorna, InGen experimented with soybean crops and other lysine-rich plants, so the entire food chain of the island has been balanced, with herbivores eating lysine-rich plants and carnivores consuming these herbivores. And just as in the first novel, it is clear that the animals on Isla Sorna are reproducing in the same way as mentioned in the first part. It is difficult to find similarities between the movie and the book, as many characters are eliminated, as well as scenes that could be disturbing for the audience. An example of this is a scene involving Howard King, George Basilton, and Lewis Dodson, characters that were eliminated from the film. They are all employees of Biosyn, another company interested in cloning dinosaurs. Dodson, Basilton, and King get out of the Jeep as they approach through the thicket to the Tyrannosaur's nest to get hold of some of the eggs. They observe the shadow cast by the parents guarding the nest. 6 meters tall, red-colored animals ending in a giant head. Dodson is armed with an ultrasound box, which, as they had found earlier, scares and disorients the dinosaurs. Basilton informs Dodson and King about a study about the skulls of tyrannosaurs. According to this study, the brain of tyrannosaurs was very similar to that of frogs, and therefore should have a vision based on the movement, that is to say, that if something happened, they should just stand still and practically disappear to the perception of dinosaurs. The tyrannosaurs watch them for a second, almost surprised by the presence of these 3 little intruders. And then they begin to roar. Dodson raises the box and points it at the animals. Instantly, the high-pitched, continuous hissing sound floods the place. In response, the tyrannosaurs roar, duck their heads, and elongate their necks. They were huge, and the sound did not intimidate them. They began to circle the mound, advancing towards Dodson. The earth trembled with every step they took. Dodson remains calm and turns the knob on the box. Basilton covers his ears with his hands. The hissing increases in intensity, reaching a painful volume. This time, the tyrannosaurs recoil as if they had received a physical blow. They duck their heads and blink at a frantic pace. They roared again, but more faintly. In the nest, they heard a terrible screaming. Dodson went ahead, pointing the box directly at the animals. The tyrannosaurs retreated, looking alternately at Dodson and the nest, shaking their heads up and down as if they were trying to uncover their ears. Dodson adjusted the knob on the box again and turned the volume back up. Now the hissing was unbearable. Dodson began to climb up the mound towards the nest. Basilton and King climbed after him. Looking inside the nest, Basilton saw 4 white speckled eggs and 2 hatchlings resembling large plucked turkeys. The 2 tyrannosaurs remained at the edge of the clearing, held at bay by the sound. Basilton and King enter the nest to seize the eggs. While Dodson holds the parents at bay, King seizes one of the eggs and flees. But Basilton is frozen with fear. He can see how the tyrannosaurs are slowly advancing as he watches them steal his eggs. Dodson calls him an imbecile and enters the nest himself to steal one of the eggs. But as he reaches down and bends at the waist, the battery in the box disconnects, suddenly stopping the sound. Silence reigned in the place. The tyrannosaurs shook their heads one last time and roared. Basilton saw that Dodson stood rigidly still, almost paralyzed. Basilton also remained motionless, held his breath, and waited on the other side of the clearing. The tyrannosaurs began to move towards him. Dodson saw the first tyrannosaur approaching. Despite their large size, they were cautious animals. Only one of the adults approached towards them, and although every few steps it stopped to roar ferociously, it did not seem very confident, as if it was puzzled by the fact that the 2 men remained there motionless. Or perhaps it could not see them. Perhaps Dodson and Basilton had disappeared for its field of vision. The other adult hung back on the other side of the nest, swaying and ducking his head nervously, but with no intention of attacking. The roars of the approaching dinosaur were terrifying. Dodson did not dare look at Basilton, who was only a few feet away from him. He stood his ground and did not give in to the temptation to run, for he thought that if he ran, he was a dead man. If he stood perfectly still, nothing would happen. With a stiff body, Dodson held the metal box in his left hand, so with his right hand, he pulled very lightly on the battery cable. In a few moments, the plug would reach his hand, and he would plug it back into the box. Meanwhile, he did not take his eyes off the approaching Tyrannosaurus. He felt the earth shaking under his feet. The Tyrannosaurus was getting closer and closer. Dodson could smell the putrid odor of the carnivore. The animal roared, and Dodson felt its breath. It was right next to Basilton. Dodson turned his head slightly and looked at Basilton. He was absolutely motionless. The Tyrannosaur was getting closer and closer. Suddenly, he raised his head in surprise. Dodson thought he couldn't really see it, as long as he stayed still. The Tyrannosaurus let out a loud roar, but Basilton did not move. The Tyrannosaurus bent down again, opening and closing its jaws, bringing its huge nose closer. The Tyrannosaurus sniffed him, but this time it seemed confident. The hesitant Tyrannosaurus pushed Basilton with its snout. At that moment, Dodson realized that the animal could see them. The Tyrannosaurus hit Basilton in the side and knocked him down without much trouble. Basilton screamed as the Tyrannosaurus's huge foot descended on him and pinned him to the ground. As he screamed and waved his arms, the animal's head came down with its mouth open and closed over his arm. Dodson heard a scream and saw something small and flaccid hanging between the jaws of the Tyrannosaurus. He quickly understood that it was Basilton's arm. The hand was swinging inertly while Basilton screamed. Hearing it, Dodson felt a cold sweat all over his body, so he immediately turned around and started running towards the Jeep back to safety. While this was going on, King was lost on his own. King came panting out of the jungle and continued walking across the plain. In the distance, there were a few dinosaurs. They had horns, so they must have been triceratops. Judging by the way they were shaking their heads and the noises they were making, they seemed to be nervous. Obviously, King would have to follow the course of the river. He had to pass the triceratops with extreme care. He decided to go ahead with or without triceratops and started walking through the tall grass. Suddenly, he heard a reptilian hissing sound coming from the grass from somewhere to his left. He also smelled a peculiar rotten odor. King stopped and waited. He heard a splash behind him, which came from the river. King saw two striped lizards wading in the river. They walked on their hind legs with a choppy, sort of hopping gait. Their dark bodies reflected in the water, and they hissed menacingly. King looked up and saw two other lizards crossing. These were already in the deep part of the river and had begun to swim. King backed away from the bank and into the grass. Then he turned around and began to run with the grass at chest height. Suddenly, the head of another lizard appeared in front of him, hissing and growling. He changed direction to avoid it, but suddenly the nearest lizard jumped into the air, reaching such a height that its entire body was in sight above the grass. King saw the legs in attack position and curved claws like daggers. King changed his trajectory again, and the lizard made a screeching sound as it fell to the ground behind him. But King kept running. The fear gave him strength. He heard the lizard's growls behind him, and he accelerated even more. He saw tall trees. He could climb one and escape from those terrible claws. From the left appeared another lizard advancing diagonally towards him. King could only see its head on the grass. The animal seemed to move at an incredible speed. He did not think he could make it, but he tried. With his lungs burning, he made a last effort. The trees were only 10 meters away. King pushed himself vigorously with his arms and legs. It was already difficult for him to breathe, when at that moment he felt a violent blow from behind and lost his balance. He felt a piercing pain in his back and knew it was the claws. When he fell to the ground, he tried to roll, but the animal had a tight grip on him. He was immobilized face down, and he could hear the animal growling above him. The pain in his back was unbearable. His head was spinning. Immediately afterwards, he felt the animal's breath on the back of his neck, and an extreme terror seized him. He then fell into a kind of lassitude, a deep drowsiness in which everything took on a slow rhythm. As in a dream, he saw the blades of grass sprouting from the earth before his face. He saw them with intensity and almost felt indifference when he felt the pain caused by the animal's jaws closing around his neck. That seemed to happen to someone else. He experienced an instant of surprise when he heard the bones in his neck crunch, and then there was only darkness. The film adaptation of Lost World seems to take inspiration from some of these moments. An example is the death of Eddie Carr, who ends up being torn apart by a pair of tyrannosaurs, something similar to what happened to Basilton in the novel. However, it is not shown with the precision that describes the book, and all that psychological horror that Crichton plays with is lost. This is not to say that the film is a bad adaptation. They are simply completely different works. Both deserve recognition in their respective areas. So if you are a fan of the film and were unfamiliar with the original work, it might be a good idea to give it a chance to amaze you once again.